My name's Andrew Jackson. I'm an environmental lawyer. I have worked in private practice as a lawyer. I then worked for a few years for the UK Government's Department for Environment, advising on nature conservation law. And then I moved over to Ireland in 2007 and did a PhD on the history of European nature law. And I now work as the Natural Environment Officer and in-house lawyer with Antashka, the National Trust, which is a charity and non-governmental organisation. Interestingly, seals have been singled out for special treatment in conservation legislation, alongside birds probably, which have often been given special treatment, in other words, having dedicated legislation. So what we saw was a very early piece of conservation legislation in the UK in 1914, the protection of the Grey Seals Protection Act 1914 rather, which was brought into law owing to concerns over dwindling numbers of grey seals in the United Kingdom. They were said at that time to be down to about 500 individuals. Now, since people have said maybe that was an underestimate, nevertheless, you know, the figures I've seen were maybe it was more like 2,000, but that's a tiny number compared to what we see now. And interestingly, it is a conservation success story in the sense of a piece of legislation which intervened and made a difference. And what it did essentially was to provide a closed season when seals could not be killed in the wild during their breeding period. By 1932, the Irish Free State, as it was then, had repealed the 1914 Act because of pressure from fishing interests. And we have to skip then to 1976 to the Wildlife Act in Ireland, which provided some protection for seals. There has been a series of legislative interventions in the UK, and over time a real growth in public opinion in favour of protecting seals and against culling, interestingly. So whatever the legal position, there has been almost a de facto bar on culling in the UK in more recent times, because public opinion is such that pressure is put on politicians to say, no, whatever the law says, whether it's possible to permit a cull, you shouldn't be doing that. It is striking, I think, to look at the changes in population of grey seals in the UK since the 1914 Act, which provided this closed season when seals couldn't be killed and taken during their breeding season. So from a low back then of maybe 500 to say 2,000 or so individuals in the UK, the year-on-year increase since that 1914 Act has been something of the order of 6%. And in 1999, the population was in or around 125,000 individuals, so a huge growth. And no doubt the population has increased again quite a bit since then. In contrast, the most recent figures that we've seen for grey seals released by the National Parks and Wildlife Service are a population estimate of between 5,000 and 7,000 individuals. Now, taking account of the relative sizes of the countries, I still think it's a striking difference in terms of the populations. One might expect there to be a larger population of grey seals. The EU started to, in a modest way at first, make environmental rules, or propose environmental rules for the countries of the EU to adopt. And the first major conservation intervention was the Birds Directive in 1979. It was a bit of a difficult time for nature regulation in Europe. The European Commission's hands were a little bit tied. They had European funding available, but the member states consistently said you can only spend that on birds. So the Commission tried its best to stretch those rules as much as it could, because there were certain critically endangered species in Europe at that time, and still, one being, interestingly, the monk seal, the Mediterranean monk seal, another being sea turtles. And so the Commission did provide some funding for monk seal conservation, and it's again an interesting example of seals being singled out for protection in a very specific way. So, what can be done? What can the interested member of the public like you or I do to drive the conservation story and to help grey seals and other iconic species and habitats? We can get onto our MEPs, our members of the European Parliament. We can get onto our national parliamentarians. We can, sign any petitions that are bound to be coming out in the next few months and years, calling for the continued existence of these powerful conservation instruments and saying, look, we want these instruments to exist. They protect our most threatened wildlife and wild areas, and absolutely they must not be downgraded or renegotiated or weakened as a sop to the British Tory party or to Eurosceptics elsewhere.